Demand Generation Practice Director, also at eDynamic. In today's presentation, we'll cover challenges with acquisition, the 3 pillars of successful acquisition, creation of the content map, leveraging digital platforms, and transforming your website into a conversion driver. At the conclusion of the presentation, we'll have a question and answer session. And now, over to Sean D'Souza from eDynamic.
Thank you, Camia, and thanks again, everyone, for joining us today. Just to do a round of introductions, we're from eDynamic, and I've got Rolf on the line. Rolf, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hello, folks. This is Rolf Krauss from eDynamic. I'm the Content Management Director here.
And I'm Sean D'Souza, and I manage the demand generation and marketing automation business at eDynamic. Just to give you, just move these slides. Just to give you an idea about who eDynamic is, we are a digital consulting firm focused on all aspects of acquisition and engagement. We are a global operation. We work with a number of organizations ranging in size from Fortune 50 financial organizations to kind of venture-funded startups. We are primarily located in the U.S. and in Canada, but we have operations in the Middle East and Dubai, as well as an offshore development team in India. So what we will cover today are the challenges faced with acquisition. Why is it's becoming so difficult for conversion to happen? Click-throughs are low, website conversions are down. What is coordinate to personalize? So what is required? What does that mean? And finally, technology, so leveraging digital platforms. I will now pass the deck on to Rolf to talk a little about challenges with acquisition. Rolf?
Yep, thank you. So one of the key things that all of us are trying to accomplish in our business is, of course, customer acquisition. And for us, that really means taking people from very early in the buying cycle, where they're perhaps still a suspect, and move to a prospect stage, and then we move them and nurture them through the buying cycle to where we're actually able to convert them to a customer. So that entire process we look at as the acquisition process. And in that way, we've also identified on a very consistent basis kind of a pattern of challenges that marketers and businesses are facing on a regular basis. One of them is just improving the engagement with the digital channels that they have. And we find that some of the difficulty there comes in the challenge of actually creating those relevant experiences that make people want to come back to your website, that they feel that the messages that you're communicating with them are aligning with their needs and where their mind is at. And then that leads into the next thing that becomes difficult, which is actually creating that two-way conversation, what we would call the digital dialogue across multiple channels, where people are not only coming to your website, but they're also leaving that digital footprint that allows you to understand what they're thinking, so you can then in return optimize your messages and package the experience that kind of addresses where they're at. The next thing is kind of moving people through the buying cycle. We all recognize that as a suspect becomes prospect and eventually a customer, their mindset about who you are as an organization, about your products, about your brand change. The questions that they have about the various services that they're looking at change. And so the answers that they're looking for are going to have to align with those changes in their mindset. So part of what we're looking to do is nurture these leads from early in the buying cycle all the way through the conversion, and making sure that we have alignment with what a person is thinking. finally, the ultimate objective for us is, of course, delivering what we would consider sales-ready leads. Leads that have matured to the point where once handed to a salesperson, they're actually actionable. They don't get thrown back into the CRM and forgotten about, but they're actually something that the salesperson can spend a short amount of time on and convert into revenue. Next. So in looking at this, one of the things that we have found is that there's a couple key pillars that enable us to address some of these challenges that we have. One of them is coordination. And coordination in a broad sense, not only within the organization, but getting the messaging to coordinate across the various platforms. The next is multi-channel, which is really identifying what are the channels that are needed to speak with individuals across the buying cycle. And finally, personalization, which is making sure that we align ourselves with where a person is at in the buying cycle. So as we look at these three pillars, and we dig down into them, next, what we find is that these things really center around, for instance, a lack of a unified messaging strategy in terms of the coordination, which means that we may have parts of the organization responsible for email campaigns, other parts of the organization responsible for the online community, and so on, each kind of crafting their own messages and presenting their own messages to the customer. The multi-channel aspect, which we agree now that, to address the customer at different phases of the buying cycle, we may have to leverage different channels to do that. We find that there's difficulty there in getting these systems to work together to provide a unified message, just from the fact that it's difficult to integrate these platforms. And finally, in terms of delivering personalization, we are seeing that we need a common view of the customer, and often these different channel platforms don't have a common view of the customer. So at this point, we presented you with a quick poll before we move on. We want to ask you to take a few seconds here and answer the poll that is in front of you, which is, are any of you using marketing automation at this point? Great. We'll give you a few seconds to respond to the poll, and then we'll continue on with the slides. Thank you for taking part in the poll. So as we move on, we're going to take a look at each one of these in a little bit more detail. Next. So one of the first things we want to look at is this notion of the unified messaging strategy. What we realized is that as we help people move through the buying cycle, we need to engage different channels. So the most typical channels that people are used to leveraging now, of course, are web and the email channel. But there may be others. People get involved in social media, so viral capabilities, Twitter and things like that. There are blogs, there are online communities. They're all part of engaging with the customer. But for today's discussion, we're going to limit the scope specifically to the email channel and the web channel. And what we're finding that is as we begin to move people through the buying cycle, we find that, as mentioned before, different parts of the organization may be responsible for these individual platforms. They're going to be working on communication and messages for those platforms. And what we have are kind of siloed messages. In the end, from a customer's perspective, what we get are different experiences. So if I were to come to the website and then perhaps get an email a few days later, in many cases, what we're finding in organizations is those do not necessarily build upon each other or complement each other. They tend to be out of sync. And so there's a couple things going on, and one in which the messages are not coordinated, and the other in which the messages from a timing perspective are uncoordinated. So next.